Welcome to the debate. Usually, when we talk about treating a severe physical injury, there is this expectation of, engineering level precision.
Right. Like like setting a bone or something.
Exactly. An X-ray reveals the jagged white line of a fracture, the doctor identifies the break, and a cast is applied. The path forward is binary, it's visible, and strictly prescribed. But today, we are stepping into the diagnostic nightmare of human grief, where the X-ray machine is utterly useless.
It's a completely different landscape.
It really is. We are examining the portrayal of profound loss and the suffocating aftermath of tragedy, as explored in two highly acclaimed literary works. We have Given and The Summer Hikaru Died. These two narratives offer entirely different maps for how we survive the destruction of our emotional world.
And the central question we have to wrestle with today is this. When analyzing the fundamental truth of how human beings process catastrophic grief, does a more accurate portrait lie in a narrative journey of healing and internal agency, or in a terrifying parasitic state of desperate denial?
Right.
Because both of these source materials use striking physical metaphors to externalize the invisible weight of loss. But the mechanisms they explore lead to violently different conclusions about what survival actually looks like.
To state my position clearly from the outset, I argue that grief is best understood and navigated as a paralysis that must be overcome through internal agency and earned growth, which Given portrays brilliantly.
And I approach this from an entirely different angle. True, profound grief is far messier and is most honestly depicted as a parasitic force that traps us in desperate, stagnant denial, a reality captured perfectly by The Summer Hikaru Died.
Let's lay out the mechanical foundation of Given to understand why this model of healing isn't just a story, but a vital framework. The narrative centers on Mafuyu Sato, a high schooler who walks around carrying a Gibson ES-330 guitar.
A beautiful instrument, but high maintenance.
Very. It's a hollow-body instrument heavily prone to feedback, and its strings are completely rusted. He carries it everywhere, but he doesn't know how to play a single chord. We soon learn this guitar belonged to his childhood friend and boyfriend, Yuki, who died by suicide.
Following a severe, unresolved argument between them, right?
Yes, exactly. Mafuyu is eventually pressured into learning the instrument by a talented, hot-headed guitarist named Uenoyama. But the brilliance here isn't the familiar trope of boys starting a band. It is a meticulous study of the mechanics of psychological paralysis.
Because he has literally lost his voice. The trauma has severed his connection to his own internal capacity for expression.
Precisely. The narrative uses the physical object of the guitar as a direct mechanism for his internal state. There is a specific, pivotal scene early on where the rusted guitar string finally snaps under the pressure of being carried around without proper maintenance. You simply cannot play a guitar with a snapped string, just like you cannot move forward with a snapped spirit.
It forces an action.
It requires active, deliberate repair. You have to wind a new string tightly enough to create the tension required to make music, but not so tight that it snaps again. That is the exact psychological tightrope Mafuyu has to walk with its grief. It requires the courage to be loud, to force air through paralyzed vocal cords against the silence that threatens to completely consume the survivor. This story operates as a survival manual because it demonstrates how grief functions as an internal state requiring deliberate action. You do not stop loving the person you died, but you find a mechanical way to carry that love without it crushing your windpipe.
I hear that, but a listener might hear this and think, well, obviously a narrative about learning an instrument and finding a healthy coping mechanism is superior to the alternative. But we have to look at the statistical and psychological reality here. Profound trauma rarely cares about what is healthy.
I suppose that's true in practice.
Right. I want to introduce the mechanics of The Summer Hikaru Died, which operates in a suffocatingly humid rural Japanese town. We follow a boy named Yoshiki, whose best friend, Hikaru, goes missing in the mountains for a week.
And then he just comes back?
He returns, and the town breathes a sigh of relief. He seems perfectly normal. But Yoshiki realizes almost immediately, through subtle wrongnesses in body temperature and gaze, that the thing standing in front of him is not Hikaru.
It's something else entirely?
It is an ancient eldritch entity that has consumed his friend and taken his place, literally wearing his skin.
A literal grotesque monster masquerading as a loved one?
A monster who, crucially, openly admits the truth to Yoshiki when confronted. Its internal anatomy is twisted and terrifying, yet it desperately begs to stay and play the role of his friend.
Which is just chilling.
It is. But here is where the portrait of grief becomes devastatingly honest. Yoshiki, driven by an unbearable, crushing sense of loss, makes the terrifying conscious decision to stay with this entity rather than face the fact that the real Hikaru is gone forever.
So he just accepts the fake?
Yes, because instead of a linear path of winding a new guitar string, learning a skill, and moving on, actual grief often manifests as an autoimmune response. The mind's own defense mechanisms, in this case total denial, become hyperactive and start attacking the survivor's reality, creating a delusion to protect against the pain of the void. Yoshiki chooses the monster over the nothingness. If Given is the beautiful, structured song of recovery, Hikaru is the raw, visceral scream of survival at any cost.
I have to admit, the fundamental premise of Hikaru Renade makes me deeply uncomfortable. I genuinely struggle to understand how any rational person could look at a monster wearing their dead friend's face, knowing the original person was consumed by it, and say yes to that arrangement.
I mean, it defies rationality completely.
It does. But when you frame it as an autoimmune response, a hyperactive defense against the void, it does tap into a very dark human impulse. Still, let's look at the foundational mechanics of what Yoshiki is actually doing. By actively choosing to harbor this entity, isn't there something inherently predatory about the specific type of grief portrayed in Hikaru?
Predatory in what sense? Are you suggesting the entity is the predator or the grief itself?
Well, both, because they are one and the same in this metaphor. The grief in Hikaru functions as an emotional hostage situation. Yoshiki's inability to cope is being actively exploited by an outside force that requires his validation to exist in the human world.
I see what you're saying.
It is a parasitic relationship that completely strips the survivor of their agency. Yoshiki becomes a passive victim to his own coping mechanism. That is why I firmly believe Given provides the superior and ultimately more truthful framework for the human spirit. In Given, the grief is localized internally. The resolution has to be pulled from within Mafuyu's own chest.
Right.
The guitar himself, he has to write the lyrics himself. His growth is earned through agonizing internal labor, which fundamentally respects and restores the agency of the survivor.
But the assumption there is that agency is something that can simply be dusted off and reclaimed if you just try hard enough. I reject the idea that the presence of a parasite makes Hikaru a lesser portrayal. The parasitic nature of the entity is precisely what makes it a masterclass in representing profound loss. Grief is a parasite.
In a metaphorical sense.
In a very functional sense. It operates with a mind of its own once it enters your nervous system. It fundamentally alters your personality chemistry. It isolates you from your community. It makes you do things, destructive, irrational things that are entirely unrecognizable to your former self. Look at Yoshiki's physical and mental degradation in the story. He is slowly losing his grip on his own humanity because that is exactly the mechanism of being consumed by grief.
But portraying grief solely as an external attacker removes the survivor's responsibility to heal. It gives them permission to just rot.
Real grief often destroys the very neurological pathways required for agency. Given is beautifully constructed, yes, but it feels like a sanitized, safe version of tragedy.
I wouldn't call it sanitized.
But it is perfectly structured to be cathartic. It builds to a crescendo that ends with a triumphant stage performance. But real catastrophic grief is rarely a beautiful performance. It is ugly, it is quiet, and it is entirely stagnant. It is sitting in a dark room with a ghost because you have completely lost the psychological vocabulary to relate to the living. By manifesting the grief as a literal physical monster, Hikaru perfectly captures the uncanny valley of life after tragedy. Everything looks exactly the same. The summer heat, the convenience store, the face of your best friend. But your brain is screaming that the foundational math of the universe is wrong. Given is a story about finding the light at the end of the tunnel.
Hikaru explores the psychology of the person who decides to sit down and build a house in the dark tunnel because their legs are simply too broken to keep walking.
Sitting in that tunnel of denial isn't a solo act, though. Yoshiki can only maintain this delusion because the entity actively, desperately participates in it, which brings us to a crucial pivot in how we analyze these mechanisms.
Where are we pivoting?
We need to look at the role of the other in the grieving process. We have to compare the entity actively feeding Yoshiki's delusion in Hikaru with the character of Uenoyama in Given, who aggressively pulls Mafuyu out of his.
Ah, the external enabler versus the external catalyst.
Exactly that. There is a very common, highly stigmatized societal critique regarding new relationships or deep connections that form after a tragic death. Outsiders are incredibly quick to label the new person as a mere replacement.
Right, just a placeholder to patch the hole left by the deceased.
Exactly. But Given anticipates this critique and methodically dismantles it through Uenoyama's specific characterization. Uenoyama is distinctly, intentionally not Yuki. Where Yuki is presented as a soft, lingering memory shrouded in the tragedy of the past, Uenoyama is loud, he is impatient, he is easily frustrated, and most importantly, he is violently alive.
He refuses to let Mafuyu retreat into silence. He demands a reaction.
He forces Mafuyu into the present tense. During band practice, Uenoyama literally yells at him when he strings the guitar incorrectly. Given successfully argues that the mechanism of moving forward is not about finding a copy of what you lost to soothe the pain.
It's about finding a jarringly different frequency.
Yes, finding something entirely different that makes life worth tuning into again. Contrast that with Hikaru, which operates as the ultimate, toxic replacement story. The entity is literally wearing Hikaru's stolen skin. It is an exact physical replica attempting to perfectly mimic the original's mannerisms. That isn't a process of processing loss. That is the definition of psychological stagnation.
I see where you're going with this.
When Mafuyu finally steps up to the microphone during their first live performance, his voice doesn't start as a song. It starts as a raw, guttural scream that rips his vocal cords, which he then forces into a melody. That goodbye is the most honest tribute you can give to the dead. The dead wouldn't want us to stay in the dark with a mimic.
Assuming we know what the dead would want is a comfort mechanism for the living, though. I hear your point about the honesty of Mafuyu's scream turning into a goodbye. It is a powerful scene.
It really is.
But the logic assumes that everyone possesses the emotional infrastructure to formulate a goodbye in the first place. You label Hikaru as toxic stagnation, but I argue that Hikaru elevates itself to a masterpiece precisely because it refuses to give the audience that cathartic easy out. It validates the highly stigmatized, deeply unhealthy side of grief that polite society demands we hide away in therapy offices.
But doesn't validating that stagnation run the dangerous risk of romanticizing the refusal to heal? If we validate Yoshiki's choice to harbor the monster, aren't we telling survivors that it's acceptable to surrender to the delusion?
It isn't romanticization. It is an unflinching acknowledgement of reality. We have to look at the sunk cost fallacy of grief that Yoshiki is trapped in. He has already sacrificed so much of his sanity and his grip on reality to protect this entity. Letting go of it now means admitting that his previous suffering, his absolute desperation, was all for nothing. Society loves a narrative like Given. We desperately want to believe that if catastrophic tragedy strikes us, we will all be resilient like Mafuyu. We will cry, we will find a new passion, we will meet someone vibrant who pulls us into the light, and we will move on.
Because it's a healthy goal?
It makes everyone around the survivor comfortable. But the clinical reality is that a massive percentage of people are exactly like Yoshiki. They are completely stuck. They are hoarding the emotional remnants of things that are irrevocably gone.
They are holding on to a rusted guitar string and refusing to change it.
Worse, they are holding on to the monster that the rusted string summoned. Hikaru asks a devastating, deeply uncomfortable philosophical question that we usually only see in science fiction concepts like the ship of Theseus.
Which is?
If you are offered a perfect breathing copy of the lost loved one, if they sounded exactly the same, remembered your shared childhoods, and desperately, obsessively wanted to stay by your side, would you actually care if it was fundamentally fake?
The rational mind has to say no. It has to recognize that the soul, the core essence of the person, is missing. To accept the fake is to disrespect the reality of the person who actually lived and died.
The rational mind sitting comfortably in a debate studio says no. But in the crushing, suffocating depths of profound loss, rationality is the very first casualty.
That's fair.
Most people want to project strength and say they would reject the uncanny fake. But Hikaru forces the reader to look in the mirror and admit a terrifying truth. In our darkest, most broken moments of absolute despair, a terrifying number of us would say yes. We would take the monster.
Just to avoid the pain.
We would embrace the mimic if it meant buying just one more day of avoiding the terrifying nothingness of the grave. Having a roadmap for healing is necessary, yes, but in the absolute depths of human suffering, having our worst, most pathetic, desperate moments validated as an understandable human response is just as crucial.
The idea that the validation of our darkest failures is just as crucial as the roadmap for our success is a profound way to look at literature. I'll give you that. But let me push back hard on your characterization of Mafuyu's journey as an easy out, or a comfortable narrative for society.
I'm listening.
The physical mechanics of what Mafuyu does in Given are excruciating. Tuning a broken guitar when your hands are shaking from trauma, physically stepping onto a brightly lit stage in front of a crowd, and forcing your paralyzed vocal cords to formulate a goodbye when every fiber of your being wants to retreat into silence, that is agonizing.
It is hard work.
It is the absolute opposite of easy. The entity in Hikarana and Yoshiki is the actual easy out. It hands Yoshiki his friend back, albeit corrupted, so Yoshiki is entirely spared the agonizing, necessary labor of confronting the void.
But that entirely ignores the immense psychological torture inherent in Yoshiki's choice. He isn't blissfully ignorant. The story makes it clear that he is constantly hyper-aware that the thing sitting across from him eating ice cream is an eldritch horror.
He knows what it is.
He notices the unnatural way it unhinges its jaw. He has to live with the deafening cognitive dissonance every single second of every day. That is its own unique, suffocating form of agony. He isn't escaping the void. He is choosing to physically embrace it, to let it sleep in his room.
Which loops us perfectly back to the core of our disagreement regarding the mechanism of agency. By choosing to embrace the void, by letting the monster sleep in his room, Yoshiki proactively surrenders his future. He traps himself in a terrifying loop.
A loop of survival.
But by choosing to scream into that microphone and turn it into a song, Mafuyu reclaims his timeline. Mafuyu's realization that he can carry the immense weight of his love without letting it permanently crush his vocal cords is a testament to the mechanics of human resilience.
If you believe that resilience is always accessible,
It demonstrates that while grief might initially manifest as an external, parasitic monster that hijacks your nervous system, it is ultimately an internal emotional landscape. And because it is internal, we possess the inherent power to navigate it, map it, and eventually master it. Engaging with loss through deliberate agency and earning your growth inch by agonizing inch provides an absolutely necessary, empowering framework for human survival.
And I will summarize my stance by reiterating that a tidy resolution, no matter how agonizingly it was earned, often betrays the chaotic, nonlinear reality of trauma. The Summer Hikaru Died operates as a dark, uncompromising mirror, reflecting the hyperactive defense mechanisms of our most paralyzing denial.
It's definitely uncompromising. It doesn't offer a mechanical roadmap to recovery because sometimes, clinically speaking, there simply is no map. Sometimes your internal compass is shattered and you're just lost in the woods with something terrifying that speaks with your dead friend's voice.
That's a terrifying thought.
It is. But that unflinching acknowledgement that sometimes human beings will willingly choose the monster and the lie just to survive the Tuesday offers a profound validation of the frailty of the human condition that a triumphant stage performance simply cannot capture.
Well, despite our starkly different views on which psychological mechanism provides the truer portrait of grief, I think we have arrived at a vital point of convergence today. Both of these source materials brilliantly utilize physical, tactile metaphors to externalize what is otherwise an entirely invisible, suffocating aftermath of tragedy.
Physically cannot be played, or the horrific reality of an ancient entity wearing a dead boy's skin. Both narratives fundamentally understand that grief is far too large to remain purely internal.
Right, it creates too much pressure.
Exactly. It has to take up physical space in the world of the survivor. It demands a vessel.
It demands a tangible manifestation. The snapped string and the stolen skin are both brilliant literary mechanisms that force the audience to confront the actual physical weight of loss. It is a testament to the necessity of having multiple frameworks for understanding the bizarre ways the human brain attempts to survive the unsurvivable.
We really do need both.
We need both the excruciatingly earned, beautiful song of moving forward and the visceral, stagnant scream of staying behind.
Because human beings are notoriously capable of both. The brain is complex enough to oscillate wildly between Mafuyu's desperate desire to heal and Yoshiki's terrifying willingness to hold on to the dark. The source material holds so much untapped nuance regarding the varied, often contradictory ways we process the unthinkable.
Absolutely.
Both of these paradigms unequivocally deserve their place in the literary canon of how we document human grief.
Which leaves us right back where we started, looking at that metaphorical X-ray of a shattered human spirit. Only now we recognize that the path to survival isn't just about identifying the fracture. It's about the terrifying mechanism of what you decide to do next.
The real challenge.
Do you endure the agonizing, blinding pain of setting the bone yourself so it can heal, fully knowing you will walk with a limp for the rest of your life? Or do you ignore the jagged white line on the screen, turn off the fluorescent lights, and willingly learn to live with the monster in the room?
A question without a binary answer, and one that shifts depending on the day.
It is a choice every survivor must make and remake for themselves. Thank you for joining us on The Debate. Until next time, we leave you to consider which portrait of loss speaks most truthfully to the mechanisms of your own understanding of the human experience.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.